On this super review, let's take a look at the TFZ No.3. So what I've got inside this box is another in-ear monitor, and it's from the company The Fragrant Zither, which I've reviewed one of their IEMs in the past. I reviewed the TFZ T2 Galaxy, which is around $60, and I found it was actually a really nice, bassy, fun sounding earphone with one fatal flaw that's kind of kept me from going back to it, and it just had pretty bad driver flex. But here we've got the TFZ No.3, which is not a $60 IEM. This thing is around $110. And I'm hopeful, even if this thing just sounds exactly the same as the T2 Galaxy, but that extra money means I don't have driver flex, I'll be happy. But I have a feeling it might actually sound even better than that. So this is a dynamic driver earphone. They describe it as a double voice dynamic driver. I don't know what that means, but maybe you do. And I think it's pretty handsome. It's got a nice clear shell, but maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's just go ahead and open up the box. We'll see what we get inside, and then I'll spend some time living with this earphone and comparing it to some other earphones that sound similar. And I'll come back and I'll let you know, is the TFZ No.3 the #1 $109 earphone? That was really corny, but you're welcome. So after listening to the TFZ No.3 for a week or so and comparing it directly to some other IEMs that I've got in this price range, as a reminder, the No.3 cost around $110, so not cheap. I'm ready to let you know what I think about this earphone, and like I typically do, I will start by talking about the build of it, which I will say is not bad, but not my favorite. I mean, just aesthetically, I think it looks alright. It's, you got these clear plastic shells with sort of a, I'm not sure if it's even a real piece of metal, but it's sort of a metallic plate on the outer shell that, I don't know, I feel like they look a little bit cheaper than they are. The build quality is pretty solid. Like there's no sharp edges at all on the plastic. They're pretty well made. They just don't look like much. And that kind of goes for the inside of it as well. From the inside of the earphone, you can see the dynamic driver. And it's not especially attractive. Not that a dynamic driver needs to be especially attractive, but when you've got clear shells, sometimes it's cool to see into the inside of an earphone, but I feel like with here, I don't know, you're not seeing much. With like a BA earphone, balanced armatures, it's a little bit more interesting. Maybe that's just me, but yeah, I don't know. I think aesthetically it's fine. Comfort-wise and fit-wise, it's pretty good. It's a little bit on the bulky side, but just a little bit. Mostly, I find that it actually fits pretty well and comfortable for long listening sessions. I didn't have any issues with the ear hooks being out of place or anything like that, so overall, I would say that the general build of the buds and the fit is pretty solid. The cable itself it's interesting, and I think I like it, but it's interesting. So, you know, you've got a 2-pin setup up here at the top, which is pretty typical. You've got these sort of covers over the 2 pins, which is somewhat typical in this day and age, which means that, you know, these things will work with basically any other 2-pin cable. But because it's got this little protrusion on here, not every cable is gonna fit it flush and precise the way that the stock cable does. That's just kind of one of those things with 2-pin cables. More interesting thing about the cable is just kind of the overall build of this. It's kind of, unlike most cables, it's not like cylindrical, it's kind of flat. So it's basically like 2 cables sort of bound together. And, you know, mostly it lies flat and it behaves pretty well. But it is a little bit stiffer than some other IM cables, and winding it up is a little bit more effort, but overall, I don't know. I think I actually do like the cable. It's just different. Oh, one other note on the build of the TFZ No.3. I mentioned that my T2 Galaxy has pretty significant driver flex, to the point that it kind of ruins my enjoyment of that earphone. And with the TFZ No.3, it doesn't have driver flex nearly as bad as the T2 Galaxy, but there is still some driver flex here, and I find that a little bit disappointing, especially at this price range. The driver flex only really becomes apparent in this earphone when I've got the earbuds completely plugged in and I squish them a little bit, right? It kind of just sounds like my ears are wet or something like that. So it's not as big an issue here as it is with the T2 Galaxy, but there is still noticeable driver flex, and I find that kind of a bummer. So build on the TFZ No.3 is pretty solid. How is the sound? Well, I will say that I like the sound about as much as I like the build, which is to say I think it's pretty good, but not my favorite. But I do think that it is a little bit more unique and is gonna appeal to certain people a lot more than it appeals to me. I mean, we can start just by saying that sensitivity-wise, this is one of the most sensitive IEMs that I've got, which means that it'll get plenty loud on basically any source. On my Walkman, it does show a little bit of hiss, which is, you know, somewhat typical of sensitive IEMs on my Walkman. It's got a little bit of a noisy amplifier in it, and that's worth knowing if you plan to be plugging these things into a smartphone. Smartphones don't tend to have very quiet amps, so it's likely that you're gonna hear some hiss on it with these things. If, I don't know, if you've got like an LG or even like a Samsung S10, they'll probably be fine, but most other headphones or most other smartphones expect a little bit of hiss. But the overall sound signature of the TFZ No.3, I mean, it's about what I expected for a TFZ, which is to say it's a pretty aggressive V-shaped sound with a very aggressive sub bass. So I think I mentioned that I've previously listened to and owned the TFZ T2 Galaxy, which is just a very classic V shape. It's got nice sub bass, bit of treble emphasis. The mid-range is a little bit sunken, and it's got a pretty fun soundstage. And these things are different from that, but in terms of overall presentation and aggressiveness, I think they're actually pretty similar. But where can we talk about some differences between the number 3 and the T2 Galaxy? I would say that the number 3 has definitely got, I think, a more pronounced mid-range or upper mid-range and a little bit less treble than what you get on the T2 Galaxy. And I think that that overall makes these feel a little bit fuller in their sound, maybe a little bit warmer, just a touch, but mostly it's kind of an aggressive, cool sound. But the T2 Galaxy, it doesn't have a lot of upper mid-range emphasis, at least to my ear, and it's more treble, so it sounds a little bit thinner. These things, I think, sound a little bit fuller and probably a little bit more pleasant in that sense. The bigger difference, though, I think, between this and the T2 Galaxy is in the sub bass, and that's going to be the biggest difference between these, the number 3s, and pretty much most other earphones, is that these things have got a ton of sub bass emphasis. And if that's what you're into, you'll probably really dig these. And it's pretty fun, I'll be frank, but I think it's a little bit overdone, at least for my preferences. You know, having sub bass emphasis versus a mid bass emphasis, I'm okay with that. Like, a mid bass tends to make the sound cloudy and a little bit congested, and I don't get that at all here. It's still got a pretty fun sound stage. It feels like a nice wide sound. Plenty of separation and layering in the different sounds. It's just, it feels maybe a little bit unnatural. I think that sub bass punch has got, it's got a nice bounce to it. Like, it feels the way that it should. It just feels like there's a little bit too much of it for my tastes. It does, again, I think it just makes this overall sound like a pretty aggressive earphone. And even though it's got that upper mid-range that I tend to like, I do think that the tonality here comes across as a little bit funky, and I don't know if it's just because of whatever that gap in between the sub bass and the upper mid-range. There's something missing there, and it prevents it from sounding muddy and cloudy while still being plenty bassy, but I do think that it comes at the expense of a more natural sounding tonality. I think it's fine here, and depending on the type of music that you're listening to, like if you're listening to electronic, I don't think that tonality will be an issue. But if you're listening to more acoustic music, more natural sounding instruments and stuff like that, it could be a little bit off-putting. Before wrapping up my notes on the sound, worth talking about the treble. I mentioned that there does seem to be less treble emphasis here versus the T2 Galaxy. And overall, like, it kind of sounds a little bit dark in the treble region, but there is a little bit of extension in the treble, sort of in the upper treble. So it never sounds like it's lacking detail, and it's got a pretty decent sparkle. Maybe that tonality funkiness is also coming from just a little bit rolled off treble and sort of the lower treble regions. No issues with sibilance, so that much I would say is good, but it's not my favorite treble. So out of 5 stars, I'll give the TFZ number 3, I think 3 stars, at least for me. I think a lot of people are gonna like this sound. You know, if you've been going through a bunch of different IEMs and you keep saying to yourself, I wish it had more bass, I think you'll be pretty happy with these, and I think you should check them out. But if big sub bass is not necessarily your thing, that's what you're gonna get with the number 3. And for me, it's a fun earphone, don't get me wrong. I do enjoy it, but it's just not my favorite. And tonality wise, I think it gets a little bit funky, and that sub bass becomes a little bit overpowering. And I think in this price range, I'm still gonna go for the Rose Mini 2 Mark II, which has got just, I think, a lot cleaner mid-range and more interest in the treble for me. It's not like a ton more treble. This is not a video about the Rose Mini 2. This is about the TFZ number 3. And if you want a lot of sub bass, well, here you go. For me, it's just not my favorite sound signature. I think it's pretty well done, but it's not my favorite. If you're interested in checking out the TFZ number 3, of course, I've got links in the description down below. And while you're down there, you can hit the like button for the video if you liked it. You can subscribe to the channel, and then I'll see you on the next super review.